Welcome back. We left off last time with a seemingly easy exercise, but it may have been quite complex as well, which was to go exploring Blender completely on your own. If you did well, you made a few messes. That's what I wanted, as in, it is important to learn how to explore. Don't be afraid. Now we will see how to reset everything all over again, as if Blender had just come out of the box. We click anywhere on the monitor to make the splash screen disappear, and if we want to make it reappear at any time, we can click on the icon in the upper left corner and select splash screen. Very easy. Well, we want to restore Blender exactly as it was when we installed it with all the default settings. We have tried, experimented, moved, clicked, applied options that now we don't remember anymore, we don't know what they meant, and we want the peace of mind that we can follow this course with full correspondence. Here we will simply go to the File and Default menu and then select Load Factory Settings. Blender asks us, are we sure? Do you want to reload the factory settings? Yes, that's what we want. By doing that, we reactivated all the settings that were there by default, so you should get a screen exactly like mine. There might be some small variations because new versions of Blender will be coming out in the future, so there might be some small graphic differences or small icon differences. However, as already mentioned, don't worry because we are talking about the basics. We are talking about learning to drive a car. And so always a steering wheel will be there, always the gearbox, or at most the automatic transmission, but we are always talking about the basics. In today's lesson we will focus on studying the Blender interface. In the meantime, let me say one thing. What does interface mean? When we study a new topic, whether it's Blender, whether it's chemistry, whether it's mathematics, whether it's philosophy, one thing that's very important in order to really understand what we're talking about is, let's pay attention. Let's stop at each word. Do we know the meaning of what we're listening to? What does interface mean? Well, the Blender interface is the way, the tool that Blender has to communicate with us, as well as it is the tool that we will use to communicate with Blender. Put very poorly, it is what we see on the screen. Although the tools that we will use to communicate to Blender what we want to do will also be others. For example, the mouse, the keyboard, the graphics tablet if we want to use it, and so much more. What we are going to see today is how the interface is broken down and also how it can be customized to our complete liking. What you're seeing right now is a window diagram that is the default interface that you will see every time you open Blender to do a job. Let me reopen the splash screen to show you what happens when we go to create a new file instead. Not general, the default one, but for example 2D animation. Here it almost doesn't even look like we're inside Blender. We have a completely different interface. What has happened? Is it still Blender? Yes, it is still Blender. Let's do one more test. Let's reopen the splash screen and open a new sculpting file, for example. Here we are presented with a still different interface, however it is still Blender. We have elements that change, that transform in order to allow us to work better in a certain area. But it is still Blender's interface, still that system that Blender uses to communicate with us. Let's go back to the default file with the basic interface, the one we're going to learn how to use to go over it together. Meanwhile, there are two elements that always remain fixed. These are the top bar and the bottom bar. These two black or almost black swipes contain elements that do not change based on the windows we are going to use within Blender. Between these top and bottom two elements, we have a series of windows. This is the main window that we will be working on most of the time. However, we see that we also have a window in this position, a window in this other position, and here at the bottom, a narrow and wide window that contains the timeline. Actually, each window can contain different types of editors. So, what is a window? A window is a frame that encloses within it a part of the Blender interface, specifically enclosing an editor. In Blender, there are many types of editors, and we can choose which editor to display in any window. This is thanks to this menu that we find in the top left corner that contains the list of all the types of editors that are present in Blender. If you notice this little button, we also find it here, inside what is now the timeline. We also find it here, inside what is the outliner, here, inside the window that encloses the properties of our work. So what we can do at any time is to go and change the contents of this window. Although we have the list of all the editors available, we will see them as we do the basic course. Some perhaps we will see in more specific courses. One exercise that I want you to do right now is to change the editor contained in the different windows of the interface. So, for example, instead of the 3D viewport, let's put the timeline here. Instead of the outliner, let's select the UV editor, and here at the bottom, for example, but make of course the choice you want. I put the movie clip editor, and here on the right we put the compositor. Well, you see we have transformed the interface completely differently. However, we have simply changed the content of the windows. We have chosen which editor to show in each individual window. If you have also followed this little exercise, now let's practice putting everything back the way it was before. Here is the 3D viewport. Here at the bottom we have the timeline. Here at the top we have the outliner, while here we have the properties editor. Well, we have seen how to change the editors inside the windows, but let's also see how to change the shape of our windows. If we move the mouse between windows, we see that the cursor changes shape. Come these two little arrows indicating that we can click and drag up or down. Do a few free trials, and then let's put it back more or less like the starting position. We also have the ability to separate a window into multiple windows. For example, if we stand here at the top edge of the window, enclosing the 3D viewport, we see that the cursor takes on this double little arrow at the top and the bottom. However, we cannot drag it because we said that the top bar cannot be changed. It just sits there motionless. If, however, instead of dragging with the left mouse button, we right-click, a menu comes up called Area Options, and it allows us to do a vertical split or a horizontal split. In this case, I'm going to do a vertical split. Blender asks me, well, where do you want to cut the window? Put it wherever you want, because then we can move it anytime we want anyway. And here we have two separate windows that contain the same editor. What is the reason why I would like to be able to have the same editor twice? We will see later on, however. To give you a very practical example, on the left I may want to see the cube from this point of view. On the right I may want to see it from another point of view. The editor is the same, however I have the possibility of using two different points of view, and that is no small thing. Do some experimentation. Try further subdivisions, and contextually, if you want, also try changing the editor in the windows. Now, however, we want to go back to the previous form. We have subdivided a few too many times. Well, how do we merge together one window with the other? We can put the mouse here at the intersection of the windows. You see it becomes a cross, so we can left click and drag up or down. For example, now I pull the down arrow. And what do I tell Blender by doing that? I tell it, look, merge these two windows together, and of the two, make the editor that's on top, override the one that's below. So it will become all 3D viewport. Another way instead to merge windows is to right-click on the boundary line and then select Join Areas, i.e. Merge Areas. Same interface. This little arrow comes up asking us, which do you want to prevail, the editor that is on the right or the editor that is on the left? We choose the one we prefer and click to confirm with the left mouse button. We understand very well that Blender's interface is very customizable, and we can have endless combinations of editors with slightly larger, slightly narrower windows depending on our needs. So what did the Blender programmers think? They said, let's make sure we can save these window configurations. Well, a window configuration with its related editors is called a layout, and there are predefined layouts that we can call up with a simple click of the mouse. Up here we see that right now layout is selected, which is the default, but we have UV editing, we have shorts, modeling, texture paint, shading, and so on. We also have the option to create our own new layout. For example, let's start from the default layout. Let's go and split. For example, into two parts, the window that contains the 3D viewport. Then let's go and click on the pluses button. Let's select duplicate current, i.e. duplicate the current layout, which right now is layout. We see that layout comes up, so we double click on it, rename it whatever we want. For example, I'm going to call it Francis, so I've created my custom layout. If we now go into layout, we find the exact same configuration, because every time we go to edit a layout, it stays saved. So if we now go back into layout and go back and merge these two areas, we will have the starting layout and our custom layout. Do some free experimentation. Don't be afraid, because at any time it will be enough to call up from the file menu the item new in general. Blender asks us if we want to save. We say no, don't save. And we see that everything is back to normal, so my custom layout is gone too. Everything is back to default. Then you will say, but how? What was the point of saving my own custom layout? Well, that serves because when you save your work, the layout will remain within that file. In addition to the objects, scenes, lights, materials that you will have created, the layout will also be saved. Whoever goes to open your file, whether it is you or whether it is another person to whom you have passed this file on, will find the layout that you have saved within the file. Let's say, on the other hand, that you want to make sure that every time you open a new Blender file, your custom layout is present. Let's do this test. Do it with me. Click plus and duplicate current. So we have layout.1. I go back to calling it Francis, then I edit it. Here I'll put in, for example, the UV editor. Well, I want to make sure that every time I start with a new file, this layout is there. To do this, we can go to the menu File and Default and Save Startup File. Blender asks us to confirm, are you sure? Do you want to save it as a startup file? Yes, we say yes, no worries. Well, we saved it as the default file. So, if we now go back to the File menu, select New and General, click Don't Save, there it is, our current layout has appeared again. We can make changes. Now, for example, I delete the cube, I insert another object, a sphere, for example. I create a new file, New and General. I don't save this because I don't care. And there I go back to having the interface that I had saved by default. Well, of course, you can go back from that as well. How? We saw at the beginning of this lesson. Very simple. We go to File and Default and Load Factory Settings. By doing that, we reset everything and go back to the beginning. Well, that's it for this lesson, but I will leave you with an exercise to do. Be sure to do it. On the interface, you will have to create your own layout with your name, divide the window containing the 3D viewport into 4 parts, and in each of them put 4 different editors, as you see in this screenshot. Once this is done, you will need to save the file by calling it Lesson 2. How do you save? The same way you would in any other software. We go to the File Save menu, then we select the place where we want to save. I, for example, will select Desktop, and then here at the bottom we find the words untitled.blend. Let's call it Lesson 2, and then click Save Blender File. Well, I, as always, thank you for following along, and I'll see you again soon.